Module 6B, line 72. Check if property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing. If property is subject to lease or any occupancy agreements, including seasonal and short-term vacation rentals, after closing, or is intended to be rented or occupied by third parties beyond closing, the facts and terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by seller to buyer, and copies of the written leases shall be delivered to buyer, all within 5 days after effective date. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the lease or terms of occupancy are not acceptable to the buyer, buyer may terminate this contract by delivery of written notice of such election to seller within 5 days after receipt of the above items from seller. And buyer shall be refunded the deposit thereby, releasing buyer and seller from all further obligations under this contract. Estoppel letters and seller's affidavit shall be provided pursuant to Standard D, except that tenant estoppel letters shall not be required on seasonal or short-term vacation rentals. If property is intended to be occupied by seller after closing, see Rider U, post-closing occupancy by seller.
Unlike the prior section, if the property is actually being sold with a tenant. So let's give a scenario. Typically, these are investment properties. These are buyers who are looking for an investment property, or maybe there's a short term left on a person's lease, on the tenant's lease, and they're willing to take it subject to the tenant, let the tenant write out their lease before they're going to.
Investors like that it's already occupied and there's already a lease agreement with somebody paying rent, that they look for that sometimes.
Exactly. So it's typically an investment property, or there's a short term and they're willing to take it subject to the tenant, let the tenant write it out, and then have the tenant leave. But there's a few really important steps that the seller has to be aware of in this. And as a listing agent, I would gather all this information before you list the property.
You have to provide the information. So if there's a lease, a signed agreement, you have to provide it within 5 days.
Exactly. So you have 5 days after the effective date. So gather that copy of the lease agreement prior to getting under contract, prior to listing the MLS. You should know the terms of that agreement as well. If there's any notice requirements, is there a way for the new buyer to back out as the new landlord? A buyer is going to be stepping into the shoes of that seller as landlord of this tenant. So in addition to the lease agreements themselves that need to be turned over, they're also going to need tenant estoppel letters. And I actually don't want to jump ahead. Let's talk about the lease agreement and what this provision says. This is not just for your 1-year residential tenant. Notice this also applies to Airbnbs, VRBOs, and those vacation rentals. Those are great investment opportunities for people. But let's just say, and we hope this is the case, especially when someone's going to buy a property for the purpose of investing.
Property manager is managing the contract and they already have bookings through the end of the year.
Exactly. We need to know what those bookings are, who the tenant is, how much it's for, and why is that important? Well, when the buyer is going to analyze whether this is a good deal for them as an investor, they need to know how much income is this property generating.
So, or somebody might want to be buying it for their own residence, and they might want to say, well, I don't want to continue with that Airbnb contract. Well, we need to understand the terms. Can they even get out of that contract?
Exactly. So it's really important if it's an Airbnb contract where they're subject to any sort of tenancy, whether it's seasonal, and sometimes you have tenants that only come down and they're snowbirds and they come down just for the winters, and especially here in Florida. So seasonal tenants, Airbnbs, VRBOs, and the traditional tenants all are covered by this clause.
And so the listing agent, again, have these materials ready, because a buyer's agent may ask for them before they're even comfortable preparing an offer, because they need to understand what are the terms that their client is going to be subject to, right?
Exactly.
So have it ready before listing, but let's just say you still have 5 days after going under contract to provide the information, and the buyers can cancel if they don't like the terms.
Exactly. So step one, if this property, and this is on listing agents, especially if it's not listed in the MLS, and sometimes people forget, step one is if there is going to be a tenant, either currently on the property or on the property at the time of closing or after closing, scheduled to come visit the property, you must check the box. That's step one. Check the box. Don't forget. And then obviously gathering the information is super important. Of course, the seller's under no obligation to share those lease agreements until they're under contract, but it needs to be done timely. You have a 5-day time limit. Now, that's the first 5-day time limit. If the buyer, and that time limit, allowing the buyer to elect to terminate this contract and receive their deposit back, that is independent of any other contingencies. So let's just say your buyer presents a no contingency offer, cash, no inspection period. And it's still subject to tenancy. They have 5 days to review the material and get exactly. So really important for both parties to understand that. And then the next 5-day deadline we need to be aware of is 5 days prior to closing. At least we get tenant estoppels. What is a tenant estoppel? A tenant estoppel is kind of like a snapshot of where the tenant is as of now. And we have the tenant sign that as well. Why is this important? So let's just say we have a tenant that doesn't want to sign a tenant estoppel. I'll give you the worst case scenario. We have a tenant that's non-compliant, doesn't want to sign a tenant estoppel, and there are provisions that account for this. And the tenant goes to move out, and at closing, the seller said, I don't have a security deposit. They used their last month's rent. They're kind of unruly. Your problem. You can adopt it. I don't have the tenant estoppel. Can't deliver it. And the buyer chooses to close and elects to close anyway. Well, now we have an unruly tenant who's going to come and knock on your door and say, give me my $2,500 security deposit back. But it wasn't transferred at closing. So the tenant estoppel is going to provide a lot of relevant information to this person's tenancy. Do they have a right of first refusal? That's huge. What if the tenant signed a lease that said they have a right to purchase this property? And under what terms? It'll tell you what their current rent is, when they last paid rent, if they have a security deposit, if the landlord is holding last month's rent. So really relevant information, and any monies that are currently held by the landlord get transferred at closing.
It's also with Airbnb, a lot of the times there's deposits that were already given to the seller, but now that booking is not until 2 months after, the new buyer has now taken possession. So those are things that need to be ironed out.
100%. So it may not be via a tenant estoppel in the case of an Airbnb, but the agreements will stipulate whether a deposit was made or not, and obviously those get transferred.
And something interesting you also said was that it's great to have these agreements, and to potentially give them to a buyer's agent to review before they even present an offer, but that the sellers don't have to.
Correct.
They don't have to until you're under contract. Then they have 5 days.
Exactly.
So let's talk about this different side of this. The seller wants to occupy the home post-closing.
Doesn't apply.
Okay.
Don't check the box.
Okay, so that's very different. Don't check this box. Look to that writer.
Exactly.